So, as I said last time, we're talking about Matthew's genealogy. And we made the point that this is a surprising way to begin a gospel, but also it's a surprising way to begin the entire New Testament. And so, what was Matthew doing when he began the New Testament in this way? And so, I argued that what Matthew's doing, at least in part, is setting the stage for this theme that we're going to trace from now on, actually from Sunday on, and that is the idea that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's story. And I think that's very important to remember when we get into chapter 2, because there are some quotations in chapter 2 that are difficult to deal with, especially if you're not looking at it from the standpoint that Jesus is indeed the fulfillment of Israel's story and Israel's scripture. Okay, so we'll get to that, of course, in due time. But I did want to say a couple of closing remarks about the genealogy of Jesus that I didn't mention last time. So I made the point that there are some surprising names in the genealogy. We have Tamar mentioned. We have Rahab mentioned. Ruth is mentioned as well. And so why are these women mentioned in this genealogy? And I think part of it has to do with the fact that they, if you read their story in the Old Testament, these are not exactly beacons of morality necessarily. So it could be the idea that Jesus, part of his work is saving people even like this within Israel's story. But it could also be that even from a genealogy like that, God can bring about the Messiah. So I think those are some possibilities. Another possibility is that they have to do with the Gentiles and the inclusion of the Gentiles. I think that's another theme, of course, that comes out in the book of Matthew. So I think all those are good possibilities for why Matthew included those names in the genealogy. But just one more reminder about the genealogy, and that is the importance of David and the importance of Abraham. So by including those two names in particular again, I think Matthew is emphasizing Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's story. All right, so let's finish chapter 1, and then we'll get into chapter 2. So could I have somebody read verses 18 through 25 of chapter 1? All right, thanks. All right, thank you. All right, so we have the story of the birth of Jesus, and it is, of course, a miraculous birth. Joseph here is in a bit of an awkward position, you might say, and at first he doesn't know what to do, but he wants to put her away secretly. Why does the text say he wants to do that? Okay? And why would he want to put her away, though? What? They were betrothed. They weren't married. Okay. Okay, so what might he have concluded? Exactly. right? I think that's the indication. So he wants to put her away, but then he's told in a dream not to do that, and so he does not do it. Notice the text, verse 25, specifically says they did not know each other, of course. That's referring to a sexual union. And again, re-emphasizing the fact that this was a miraculous birth. Now, in addition to all that, Matthew is very quick to point out that this is to fulfill Scripture. So we see this quotation here at the end of chapter 1. This is the first, I guess you could say, official formulaic quotation. There are 4 in chapter 2, and it seems with every one of them, there are some questions. They're not apparent. These aren't the texts that we might have quoted if we were writing it, but of course we're not. Okay? So this again brings up some interesting questions. I ask, why did Matthew begin the gospel the way that he did? And now the questions are, why did he choose these texts to quote at this particular juncture? This one's a little easier, although there is a difficulty associated with it. And that is verse 23, which is from what passage? Isaiah 7:14, right? Anybody know the original context? Anybody remember what that was? Well, it's Ahaz, right? Yeah, exactly. So Isaiah is telling Ahaz, because Ahaz says, well, Isaiah says, give me the king says, give me a sign. It could be basically anything you want. Isaiah says, okay, here it is. And so then he says, Isaiah 7:14. Now, if you look in some modern English translations, if you look at the Old King James or the New King James and some of the more conservative, I'm not sure what the New American Standard says, but I would assume it's at least a footnote in the New American Standard. I can't recall what the ESV says, but if you turn back to Isaiah 7:14, it might say, behold, a young woman will conceive. And that's because the Hebrew text, a better translation may be a young woman. But the word that's used there can mean a virgin. And so when Matthew quotes this passage, he's quoting the Greek version of Isaiah. And in the Greek version of Isaiah 7:14, the word is virgin. There's no question about it. Okay? So he quotes the Greek version, which I think you could say is a little more specific than the Hebrew. I wouldn't say it's a mistranslation. Some people say that. So could you imagine that one little minute change caused all kinds of controversy among Jews and Christians in the early centuries of our era? Back and forth they went. And even there were additional Greek translations of the Old Testament, and they have a different word. And I think it's in response to this idea. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that out because sometimes if you look this passage up, your translation may have young woman, and you may say, well, why does it have young woman? Well, hopefully I haven't made it too obscure why that's the case. The important thing is about the quotation is not just the idea that it points to a miraculous birth, but also they shall call his name Emmanuel, and then he says, which means God with us. Why would Matthew add the translation? Because you could translate the end of the verse, which is translated God with us. Why would Matthew have to do that? Well, I think the people he's writing to, they don't know Hebrew. Okay, so you look at Emmanuel, you say, what does that mean? And so Matthew says, this is what it means. All right? So that's just, again, a technical question, but it's important. This is a better question. What's the significance of the Emmanuel title? What does that signify in relation to Jesus? What? Right. Now think about this. We're at the very beginning of the whole thing. And we already have what would have surely been an outrageous and controversial statement within the context of Judaism at the time that was so strictly monotheistic. And yet, somehow, Matthew ties Jesus, this person who's born like human beings are born, he now associates him with God. And we have to go even further. When we see the word God in the New Testament and it is applied to Jesus, we're not talking about some God that's way out there, some notion that some of the founders of our country had that they were deists, and so God, well, he might have created the universe, but he's way out there now. That's not the God they have in mind. It's Yahweh. It's the God of the Old Testament. It's the God who led Israel out of Egypt. It's the God who made the promises to Abraham and later to David as well. Okay, so we have to remember that. This is serious business when he says Emmanuel, God, Yahweh with us. Do you think Israel at this time, think about it from if you were a Jew living at this time, would you think that Yahweh was not with you? What would you think? What would you think about your relationship as a nation to Yahweh at this period? What might you think?
Jews were raised on the idea of being set apart.
Okay.
God's chosen people, whether knowing their history, whether they were in power or not, they were still God's select.
Right. And the temple's still standing at this point, right? So, is there a good reason to doubt that there's no relationship there? I don't think so, right? So when he says this, again, do you think some Jewish readers or hearers of this notion would have thought, no, wait a minute, how is it different in the case of Jesus that Yahweh is with us? And that, of course, is what he will seek to unpack in various ways in the rest of the gospel. So again, I think this is just such a striking idea in that particular context. So verse 24, Joseph woke from sleep. He did it as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and called his name Jesus. What's the name Jesus mean? Anybody know? Okay. It's basically, in Hebrew, it's Joshua, Yeshua. And it means Yahweh saves, right? Yahweh saves. Okay, so again, pointing to this idea that it is Israel's God who saves. That's in the very name of this this individual that we're meeting here in the Gospel of Matthew and Jesus, of course. All right, anything else about this before we move on? Any questions or comments? Okay, so let's now move to chapter 2. And chapter 2, again, he's presenting the birth of Jesus. He's presenting these stories in connection with the birth of Jesus. And is this history? Yeah, I believe it is. But there's also so much more going on. Okay, and that's what I'm going to try to unpack today. So now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." All right, so Jesus, after he's born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod, which Herod is this? Anybody know? There's so many Herods, I mean, it gets confusing, right? Which one is this? Well, it's Herod the Great, right? So Herod the Great's the one who added on to the temple and made it, Josephus says, it's like, one of the marvelous things you could ever see. I think he actually says it's the most marvelous thing you could ever see, which of course, okay, Josephus, let's back up a little bit. All right, maybe impressive, but, come on. Anyway, this is Herod the Great who accomplished that. He dies in 4 BC. So what does that mean about dating the birth of Jesus? Well, it had to be before 4 BC, right? Because this is happening after his birth. Okay, that seems strange because we may think, well, wait a minute, isn't the whole calendar supposed to be around his birth? And it is, but it's off a little bit, okay? And so it's, Jesus then was born sometime before that, okay? So, Herod, as we will certainly talk about in a little bit, but I want to go ahead and say this. He's known for his cruelty. And this applies to people of all ages. We're going to see it, of course, to the very young. But he's known for that. Okay? Josephus, in his Antiquities, I think it's books 14 to 17 or something, you read all about Herod. And so Josephus is very helpful in that regard because he helps us frame the background of who this guy is. Because Matthew doesn't tell us, he doesn't give us a biography of Herod. That's not what he's doing, okay? But he does tell us one piece of information I think is very important. Herod the king. And I think there's a contrast here where Matthew wishes to contrast Herod as king with Jesus, who's the real king. And I also think, I'll get into this in a little bit later, I also think there's a contrast between Jesus and the king of the Roman world, that is, the emperor. Okay, I'll say more about that in a minute. I think that's very clear in Luke. I think it's less clear in Matthew, but I do think it's going on, as we'll see in just a minute. Okay, now, who are these wise men? Okay, what's the usual, or what's the more well-known translation of that idea, or that word? Instead of wise men, what? Remember? Magi, right? That's the classic way to understand them. All right, now, who are these guys? Well, it just says they're from the east. They come to Jerusalem. What do we know about them before this chapter? About these specific magi? Not a thing. They just kind of show up, right? So, what were magi supposed to be in the ancient world? Well, there's this idea that they were well respected for their wisdom. They were dream interpreters. There's some occasion to think that they may have been Zoroastrians or something. And some people have actually said, well, what's going on here is Matthew is giving a contrast between Jesus and Zoroaster, or Zoroastrianism rather. And that's just no, I don't think that's what's going on. But that's a possibility that they're at least from that region in Persia, and they may be familiar with that. I don't know for sure. He just says from the east. He doesn't specify. So I don't think that part is particularly important. What is so special, though, about these guys coming to see the birth of Jesus? I think that's a valid question. Why is it significant? Because you think about everything that's going on. Do you think there are other things going on related to the birth of Jesus that Matthew doesn't tell us? Absolutely. We know that's the case because we have Luke, right? So we know that's the case. So the question is, what's so special about this particular occasion? Well, there are other sources we can look at which tell us something about the nature of these magi and how they were viewed in the Greco-Roman world. So, for example, we have this passage from Cicero's De Divinatione, which is on divination. And Cicero says this, and this is about Cyrus, the king of Persia. So he says, but take this instance. Once upon a time, Cyrus dreamed that the sun was at his feet 3 times, so Dinon writes. He vainly tried to grasp it, and each time it turned away, escaped him, and finally disappeared. He was told by the Magi, who are classed as wise and learned men among the Persians. That's a good general definition, by the way. that his grasping for the Son 3 times portended that he would reign for 30 years. And thus it happened, for he lived to his 70th year, having begun to reign at 40. And by the way, I mean, that's correct with what we know about the chronology of Cyrus's reign. But anyway, notice how the Magi are depicted in this particular passage. They're wise, they're learned men, but also they thought that he would reign for 30 years. In other words, they were part of deciphering this event that was important to the entire world. I think that points us in the direction as to what's going on in Matthew chapter 2. Here's another passage. This is from Diogenes Laertius, who wrote a book in the first century, late in the first century. It's called Lives of Eminent Philosophers. He gives you biographies of people like Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus and Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, etc. And so this is about Socrates, who he's writing about in book 2. He says, Aristotle relates that a magician came from Syria. Notice magician, it's the same word, by the way. Diogenes Laertius is in Greek. Cicero's in Latin, so it's a little different. But Diogenes Laertius is writing in Greek. It's the same word that we have here in Matthew 2. So Aristotle relates that a magician came from Syria to Athens and, among other evils with which he threatened Socrates, predicted that he would come to a violent end. So again, we have these magicians from the East being involved in something that is of tremendous significance. Socrates is one of the most well-known people in Western history, and he's been that way for a long time, including during the time of the Greco-Roman period. He was viewed in that way as well. Okay, so we have magicians present at those important events, and so here they are, knowing therefore that something significant is happening in the birth of Jesus. And I think there may be a slight contrast here, because who are they associated with in this passage? Well, let me go back. They're associated with Herod, of course. Okay? They have this wisdom and this knowledge that this person who is born is actually the real king. That, notice he says, the king of the Jews. You think Herod liked that? That they're calling somebody else king of the Jews? Well, of course he didn't like that. So later on, it says that he was troubled by this. And then they tell him in verse 5, again, we have a quotation in verse 5 from the book of Micah. Why did they tell them? Why do these wise men ask, or these magi ask this question? Because they don't know the Old Testament. Okay, so that's why they asked the Jewish leaders. So again, why did they come? Because this was the pronouncement of a tremendously important event. And I think there's a contrast between the magicians who are from the East, who don't know the Scriptures, and yet they're convinced that this person being born is important, with Herod, who's the king, and he doesn't know it. Okay, I think that's going on as well. All right, now, down to 7 through 12. So Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. What does that verse tell us about the knowledge of the wise men? Just that verse. What? Yeah, or at least they had knowledge, right? And astronomy is certainly an aspect as well. So, yeah, what time the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." Well, that sounds sincere, right? Well, we know, of course, that's not sincere. That he would come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed from their own country by another way, and there were 3 of them. Oh, wait, it doesn't say that, right? That's one of those things that modern imagination has sort of taken over. Notice it doesn't tell us how many there are. And they don't come to any manger, right? That's just not in the text. That's something that gets conflated and added to later on. Okay, anyway, Herod wants them basically to tell him where this child's at. What's Herod's problem? Why is he so upset about this? Right, he's a competitive king. And I suppose he thinks, now, if these guys from the east, wherever that is, but they're not Jewish, if even these guys believe this man is the real king, think about how much trouble I'm going to have when people around here realize that. So he wants to squash that immediately, right? He wants to do away with that threat right this minute. And so he says, you tell me where he is, and I'll worship him, which of course is total baloney, right? That's not what he's wanting. Okay, so then we have this business about the star, and I think there's something else going on here as well. Astronomical phenomena, as you may know, are often connected to the births of really important people. But there's something really significant, I think, going on about this time, and it had been going on for a long time, and it had to do with Julius Caesar, and then how Octavius, his successor, how he had actually divinized his predecessor. Okay, so let's start with the right. You have a coin, and on the left side of it, it says Caesar Augustus. Okay, clearly to honor the emperor. And then to the right, you have a star, and it says Divus Iuliu, and that means Divine Julius. Okay, so it's again. This star is associated with the apotheosis of Julius Caesar. In other words, when he died, there was this story that went around that this star was seen for 7 days. And Octavius, remember, he's the successor, he says, oh, well, this represents him becoming a god. And as we know, many emperors were divinized after their death. Some of them, of course, were divinized during their lifetime. When you talk about the really crazy ones, like Nero and Domitian, they're later, of course. All right. Now, on the left, we have further evidence that this story was in circulation. This is a little bit later, but Servius is a commentator to the poet Virgil. And I know now we're getting off in the weeds, right? But all I want you to see is that this notion is very prevalent. This is just one coin out of many. And this is just one passage out of many. So, but the haruspex, and I would imagine he probably didn't use that word at work today, but that word means someone who looks at the entrails of an animal to like predict the future, basically. Okay, which is a very common idea. It's in the Old Testament in reference to other peoples and prophets, I suppose. Okay, it's also very common in the Greco-Roman world. Obviously, it's forbidden, in the Bible. But that's what this guy does. So he might say he's kind of like a fortune teller or something. But the haruspex Vulcatius said in a public meeting that it was a comet signifying the end of the 9th age and the beginning of the 10th, but that since he was revealing the secret against the will of gods, he would immediately die. It's kind of funny. Anyway, he fell dead in the public meeting without having finished his speech, yet Augustus included this too in the second book of the memoirs of his life. Yet again, here's attestation that this was believed all over the place. By the way, when you see something minted on a coin, how many people do you think saw that? quite a few, right? When a coin is minted, that tells you that behind that, and I'm not being, this is not me being a conspiracy theorist. It's just the way it is. This is propaganda. This is political propaganda. Because if Octavius can convince people that Julius Caesar became a god after he died, well, what might they think about him? And indeed, he's referred to as the Son of God. So do you think that Christians knew what they were doing when they referred to Jesus as the Son of God? They knew exactly what they were doing. But you see, it didn't matter, because they were ultimately convinced that he was the true Son of God. Not Octavius, not Tiberius, nobody, Nero, none of them. It's Jesus. Okay, this to me is remarkable. I think this is what's going on. Okay, because the other idea included with this star is that it was also supposed to bring about a time of peace and joy, and things have never been this good. That's part of the propaganda message, and that's what a lot of writers, by the way, said about Octavius' reign. Okay, so all this fits together with what Octavius wanted to do. He's a brilliant political mind. Do you think this story in Matthew has anything at all to do with that? I think it does. Again, I think it's the way of saying, no, the real star is pointing to and signifies something about the real king. So already, implicitly, in chapter 2, we have a statement that Herod's not the real king, and I think too, and you may disagree, that's okay, but I think too, it's being said that the Roman emperor is not the king either. Jesus is. And he's just now been born. Think about what's already potentially being stated about the birth of this individual, who, of course, is so much more than an individual. Yeah.
Something to go along with that. I think it's at least possible that if these were indeed magi that were Persians, we can go back to the book of Daniel and see possibly where they would have gotten this type of information. If you look at Daniel, the second chapter, verse 44, this is where he's interpreting the dream. He says, it's in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. And he goes on and on. It very well could be, after this, he's promoted to be basically head over all of the magi, we'll call them. It would have been very plausible for him to have continued this understanding to those, and they were actually some that were looking for him, and it would have followed exactly the same in what you're describing.
Maybe.
This is the time when we should have been looking for it, and there's the place that we're looking in. By the way, there's a star too. So when
Maybe.
you put all that together.
Maybe. It could be. And in fact, in the Greek version of Daniel, when it's talking about those individuals, it uses the same word. So I think you may be onto something there. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
We have to remember there are Jews living all over the East.
Yep.
I mean, most
That's right.
of the Jews that were carried off in captivity never came home.
That's right.
90% of them never did. They're all over the East.
Yep.
The story of the coming Messiah, all of that, could easily be known by people who are associated with it.
Yep. And there is evidence among non-Jewish writers that they expected a king to come out of Judea. I didn't bring that up because that's a little bit more obscure. I know that's hard to believe, something more obscure than Servius or these coins, right? But it's even more obscure than that. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that Herod the Great's reputation at the time was pretty brutal.
Yep.
When he gathered all the scribes and, or the Jews together, the chief priests and everything, at the time, if they thought that the Savior was born in Bethlehem, then they would have still been under the impression that it's the Savior of an earthly king like they had thought. Why would they have told Herod? I understand why the wise men may have been confused as to, his tactics or what he was intending, but wouldn't they have known his motivations? Or, I've always wondered why they told him
Oh, are you talking about,
where Jesus was at.
are you talking about this verse in verse 5?
Yeah.
Okay, he was troubled in all the Jerusalem. Something. He inquired. Okay, yeah. So Herod tells them, and which is, I think, is also funny because he doesn't know, even though he's the king. So what your question is? Why would they tell him?
Yeah, I guess if they thought that, like, what would be his motivation, it would be good.
Well, do you think it'd be wise for them to go against the king? I don't. Okay, so that's a partial answer, but I don't really think the text addresses that question. I just think it says they told him this scripture, regardless of his motivation, regardless of whether they knew the motivation, regardless of or whether they went along with the motivation. I don't know, but you know, I would imagine they're kind of in on the idea that this guy can't be the Messiah, regardless of what these people think. So they would have probably agreed with him in that case, and agreed with the fact that he was willing to go to whatever lengths he did to get him out of the way. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but okay. One more thing about this. I forgot about this. I'll read this quickly, but this is from Ovid. Another reference to this idea. Then Jupiter, the father, Jupiter's the Roman equivalent of Zeus, of course, take up Caesar's spirit from his murdered corpse and change it into a star so that the deified Julius may always look down from his high temple on our capital and forum. And then he tells the rest of the story and includes the goddess Venus as part of this. She carried it, she felt it glow, it took fire, loosed it from her breast, it climbed higher than the moon, and drawing behind it a fiery tail shown as a star. My point is, this is all over the place. So, would Matthew have known about this idea? It'd be hard to think he wouldn't. Okay, now, that's sort of, you might say, the Roman political aspect, but there's also, of course, a Jewish aspect, and that's Numbers 24:17. Okay, it's hard not to read Matthew 2, and rather, it's hard to read Matthew 2 and not think about this passage. This is the prophet Balaam, or Balaam. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Now, what's interesting is Matthew doesn't quote this passage in chapter 2. And I think the reason for that is the formula quotations in Matthew 2, which there are 4 of them, they're all about geography as it pertains to what's happening with Jesus. And so I think that's really why he, again, Matthew isn't just willy-nilly quoting Scripture and telling all this stuff. I think he has a very definite plan. And again, of course, he's inspired. But I also think he has a very definite plan of what he wants to do. And I think this passage would have easily come to mind to a Jewish reader or hearer of this particular part of the book. Okay? So again, we've got scriptural fulfillment going on, but we also have, I think, a direct challenge to Roman political, theological, and philosophical ideas of the time as well. So this is the last thing I'll say. But when we think about the birth of Jesus, this is of cosmic importance. So it shouldn't surprise us. Hopefully none of this surprises you that it's taking place on the world stage at the time and is a direct challenge to the most powerful people in the Roman world at that time. All right, we'll continue this on Wednesday. Thank you.